Part 1. The day they left. The morning they left for the beach started like any other summer morning, except for one small detail. They didn't invite me. If you enjoy powerful family stories about respect, betrayal, and quiet revenge, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths. And the day my own family left me behind with their dog changed everything. My name is Arthur. I'm 71 years old. For most of my life, I worked construction. 38 years climbing scaffolding, pouring concrete, and building houses for other families. The irony is, the house I built for my own family eventually stopped feeling like mine, even though my name was still on the deed. At least, it was that morning. 3 years ago, my son Mark and his wife Julia moved into my house. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. They had hit a rough financial patch. Mark's business wasn't doing well, and Julia had just lost her job. Just for a few months, Mark told me. Family helps family. So I told them they could move in. They brought their furniture, their kids, their dog, and eventually, their attitude. At first, everything seemed fine. The grandchildren filled the house with laughter. Julia cooked dinners. Mark talked about getting back on his feet. But slowly things started changing. Small things. The kind you almost ignore. Julia began referring to the house as our place. Mark started redecorating rooms without asking. The garage where I kept my tools suddenly became storage for the kids. I told myself it didn't matter. It was still my house. One evening, Julia made a suggestion. "You should let Mark handle the bills," she said. "He's better with finances." Mark nodded like it was already decided. I didn't like the idea, but I agreed, because I trusted my son. That was my first mistake. A year later, Mark sat me down at the kitchen table. "Dad," he said carefully, "we should probably add our names to the house." "Why?" "Just for security," Julia said quickly. "In case anything happens." I hesitated, but they insisted it was just paperwork, something to make things easier for the family. I didn't realize at the time how important that decision would become. Then came the beach trip. It was early July. Mark walked into the kitchen holding car keys and sunglasses. "We're heading to the coast for a few days," he said. "Good for you," I replied. Julia came in behind him carrying bags. "The kids are excited," she said. Then she pointed toward the living room. "And we need you to watch Rocky." Rocky was their dog, a loud, stubborn golden retriever that chewed everything he could find. "You want me to dog sit?" I asked. "It's only 3 days," Julia said. I looked around. Suitcases, beach chairs, coolers. Not one person had thought to ask if I wanted to go. "Did it ever occur to you," I asked slowly, "that I might want to come too?" Julia laughed lightly. "Oh, Arthur, you'd hate the heat." Mark added quickly, "And someone needs to stay here. Someone. Not Dad, not family. Just someone." An hour later, their SUV pulled out of the driveway. The kids waved. Julia didn't look back, and Mark shouted something through the window that I'll never forget. "Don't let the dog wreck the place." The place. Not my house. Just the place. I stood on the porch watching their car disappear down the road. Rocky barked beside me, and for the first time in years, the house felt quiet again, but not peaceful, just empty. That evening I walked through every room. The living room Julia redecorated. The kitchen where Mark had taken over the bills. The garage where my tools used to be. And suddenly something became very clear. This house wasn't really mine anymore. Not the way it used to be. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. My lawyer. When he answered, I said something simple. "I need to make a small change to the house paperwork." There was a pause. "What kind of change?" I looked around the kitchen one more time. Then I smiled slightly. "The kind my son isn't expecting." Because while Mark and Julia were enjoying the beach, they had no idea what I was about to do. Part 2. The call to my lawyer. My lawyer answered on the second ring. "Arthur, everything all right?" His name was Martin Caldwell, and he had handled my paperwork for nearly 20 years. Wills, taxes, property transfers, anything that required a signature and a witness. "Martin," I said, "I need to review the ownership on my house." There was a short pause. "Something wrong?" "Maybe," I replied. "I just want to know exactly how it's set up." Martin typed something on his computer. "Well," he said after a moment, "the house is currently listed under 3 names. I know. Yours, your son Mark's, and Julia's." I leaned back in the kitchen chair. 3 names. I remembered the day I signed those papers. Julia had brought them home from some office downtown. "Just routine paperwork," she said. Mark nodded beside her. "It'll make things easier if something happens to you, Dad." At the time, I thought they were being thoughtful. Now I wasn't so sure. "So tell me something," I asked Martin. "If I wanted to remove my name from the house, could one?" He paused again. "That's a very specific question." "Answer it." "Yes," he said. "You could transfer your share." "To who?" "That depends on what you want." I stared out the window at the empty driveway. Mark's SUV was already halfway to the coast by now. Laughing. Relaxing. Enjoying a vacation in the house I built. "Martin," I said slowly, "how much of the house do I technically own?" "Half." "Half?" "Yes," he replied. "When the paperwork was done, you kept 50%. Mark and Julia share the other half." That surprised me. "Why did you arrange it like that?" "You told me to." For a moment, I couldn't remember. Then the memory came back. 3 years ago, after signing the papers, I had called Martin privately. "Just in case," I had told him. "Keep half in my name." At the time, it felt unnecessary. Now it felt like the smartest decision I had ever made. "So if I transfer my half," I asked, "what happens?" "Well," Martin said, "ownership would change." "How?" "It depends who you give it to." I smiled slightly. because a very interesting idea had just formed in my mind. "Martin," I said, "are Mark and Julia home right now?" "You'd know that better than I would. They're at the beach." "For how long?" "3 days." He chuckled softly. "That's a convenient window." Rocky barked from the living room, probably chasing his tail again. I stood up and walked toward the window overlooking the backyard. The garden my wife planted years ago was still there. The porch swing we bought on our 10th anniversary still creaked in the wind. Everything in this house had a memory attached to it. Everything except the way Mark and Julia treated me now. "Martin," I said. "Yes?" "I want to transfer my half of the house." He waited. "To who?" he asked. I smiled. "Not to my son." There was a long pause on the phone. "Well," Martin said carefully, "that will certainly surprise them." "That's the idea." He asked the obvious question. "Who do you want the ownership transferred to?" I looked at Rocky lying on the floor beside the couch. The dog was the only one in the house happy to see me. I laughed quietly. "No, not the dog." Martin chuckled. I was wondering. Then I told him the name. A name Mark and Julia had completely forgotten. A person they hadn't thought about in years. When Martin heard it, he whistled softly. "Oh, that's clever. Is it legal?" "Completely. And permanent?" "Very." I nodded. "Good. Come to my office tomorrow morning," Martin said. "We'll sign everything. And then?" "Then your son will discover the house doesn't belong to you anymore." I smiled. "No," I said. "It still won't belong to him either." After hanging up, I walked into the living room. Rocky wagged his tail. "Well, boy," I said, "looks like this house is about to have a new owner." The dog barked happily. And somewhere on a beach a few hundred miles away, my son was enjoying a vacation in a house that was about to change owners, without him knowing it. And the look on his face when he came home was going to be unforgettable. Part 3: The New Owner. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Old habits never really leave you after 40 years of construction work. My body still believed mornings were meant for coffee and hard decisions. Today was going to be both. Rocky followed me into the kitchen, his nails clicking across the floor as I poured coffee into my favorite mug. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It reminded me of the way things used to be before Mark and Julia moved in. Before the arguments. Before the slow realization that I had become a guest in my own home. By 8 o'clock I was sitting in Martin Caldwell's office. He greeted me with a folder already waiting on his desk. "You weren't kidding," he said. I printed everything. I sat down and opened the folder. There it was. A property transfer document. My 50% share of the house. The space for my signature waiting at the bottom. Martin leaned back in his chair. "Once you sign that, things change permanently." "I know. Your son won't be able to undo it." "I know that too." He studied me carefully. "Are you sure this is what you want?" I thought about the beach trip. The way Mark called my home the place. The way Julia laughed when I asked if I could come along. And the way they left me behind with their dog like I was the housekeeper. "Yes," I said. I'm sure. Martin slid a pen across the desk. Then go ahead. For a moment, I just stared at the paper. 38 years of work had paid for that house. Every nail, every brick, every mortgage payment. And now I was giving half of it away. But not to Mark, not to Julia, to someone who actually deserved it. I signed my name. The ink dried almost instantly. Martin picked up the paper and stamped it with a loud, official thud. Well, he said, congratulations. On what? You've just changed the ownership of your house. 2 hours later, the paperwork was filed. Legal, permanent, final. And the person who now owned half the house with Mark and Julia? My daughter, Emily. Emily lived 3 states away. Mark's younger sister, the one Julia never liked, the one who had stopped visiting after too many uncomfortable dinners. But Emily had always stayed close to me. Phone calls every week, birthday cards, visits whenever she could manage the time. And most importantly, she never treated the house like it was a prize waiting to be claimed. I called her that afternoon. Dad, she said when she answered. Everything okay? Yes, I said. I just wanted to tell you something. What? Well, you're now the co-owner of my house. There was silence. Then she laughed. Okay. You're going to have to explain that. So I did. Everything. The beach trip. The pressure to sell. The forged attitude of ownership. By the time I finished, Emily was quiet. Dad, are you serious? Very. Mark is going to lose his mind. I chuckled. He might. She asked the obvious question. What happens now? Well, I said, when Mark and Julia get back from the beach, they'll discover the house belongs to you two. Emily laughed again. Oh, wow. And if they ever try to sell it without asking? They can't. Exactly. That evening I sat on the porch with Rocky. The sunset painted the sky orange and purple. For the first time in months, I felt calm. Not angry. Not bitter. Just calm. Because sometimes you don't need revenge. You just need the truth to reveal itself. 2 days later, Mark's SUV pulled into the driveway. The kids ran inside laughing. Julia carried beach bags through the door. Then Mark walked into the kitchen and saw me sitting there. Hey, Dad, he said cheerfully. Everything good? I smiled. Oh, yes. Good trip? Great, he said. Then Julia asked the question she always asked. Nothing happened while we were gone, right? I nodded slowly. No. Nothing at all. Then I added one small sentence. Except the house has a new co-owner. The smiles on their faces disappeared instantly. And the look that followed was worth every second of that beach trip. Part 4. The shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mark stood in the middle of the kitchen with his car keys still in his hand. Julia froze beside the counter. The house has a... What? Mark asked slowly. A new co-owner, I repeated calmly. Julia laughed nervously. Arthur, what are you talking about? I took a sip of my coffee. Exactly what I said. Mark frowned. That's not possible. It is. How? I slid a folder across the table. Inside were the documents Martin had prepared. Mark opened them quickly. Julia leaned over his shoulder. At first they looked confused. Then Mark's face changed. His eyes moved quickly across the page. Dad, what is this? Legal paperwork. Julia grabbed the papers from him. Her voice rose immediately. You transferred your half of the house? Yes. To who? Mark asked. I leaned back in my chair. To your sister. The room went completely silent. Julia stared at the page again, then back at me. Emily? Yes. You gave half the house to Emily? I did. Julia's face turned red. You can't just do that. I shrugged. Actually, I can. Mark ran his hand through his hair. Dad, why would you do this? I looked at him carefully. Because someone needed to remind you whose house this really was. Julia slammed the papers onto the table. This is unbelievable. Is it? Yes, she snapped. You're trying to start a family war. No, I said quietly. I'm ending one. Julia pointed toward the hallway. We live here. I know. This affects our family. I know that too. Mark finally spoke again. Does Emily even know about this? Yes. When did you tell her? 2 days ago. Julia shook her head in disbelief. She lives 3 states away. That's right. So now she owns half a house she doesn't even live in? Yes. Julia started pacing across the kitchen. This is ridiculous. No, I said calmly. It's balance. Mark frowned. Balance? Yes. You and Julia already owned half the house. Now Emily owns the other half. Julia glared at me. You did this to punish us. I shook my head slowly. No, I did it to protect myself. Julia crossed her arms. From what? I met her eyes. From the day you decide this house belongs entirely to you. Her expression tightened. That's not fair, isn't it? Mark looked down at the paperwork again. Dad, you should have talked to me first. I nodded. You're right. Then why didn't you? Because the last time I trusted you with paperwork, someone tried to convince me to sell my house. Mark looked embarrassed. Julia said nothing. I stood up slowly and walked toward the living room. Rocky wagged his tail. The dog was the only one in the room still happy. Behind me, I heard Julia whisper sharply, "This is going to be a nightmare." Mark sighed. Maybe we should calm down. But Julia wasn't calming down. She looked at me and asked one last question. So what happens now? I turned back toward them. That depends. On what? On whether you remember something very important. Julia frowned. What? I smiled slightly. This house doesn't belong to just you anymore. And the next conversation we were about to have was going to change everything about how they lived in it. Part 5. The Rules of the House. Julia stared at me like she couldn't decide whether to shout or laugh. This is insane, she said. No, I replied calmly. It's paperwork. Mark was still looking at the documents in his hands. reading them over and over as if the words might change the next time he looked. "They're real," he muttered. Julia snapped. "Of course they're real. Your father just handed half the house to your sister." Mark looked up at me. "Dad, you really did this?" "Yes." "Without even talking to us?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the way you two discussed selling my house without talking to me?" The kitchen fell quiet again. Julia crossed her arms tightly. "You're trying to make a point." "Yes." "Well, congratulations," she said bitterly. "You made it." But Mark didn't seem angry. He seemed thoughtful. "What does this mean legally?" he asked. "It means Emily owns half the house with you," I said. "And you?" "I don't own any of it anymore." Julia blinked. "Wait, what?" I nodded. I removed my name completely. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "So you don't own the house anymore?" "No." "Then why would you do that?" "Because it changes the situation." Mark looked confused. "How?" I smiled slightly. "Because Emily and I already talked about it." Julia's eyes narrowed. "Talked about what?" "About rules." The word landed hard. "Rules?" Julia repeated. "Yes, for the house." I walked over and picked up the paperwork again. Emily agreed to something very simple. Mark leaned forward. "What?" "That the house will never be sold." "Unless all owners agree." Julia frowned. "So?" "So if you ever try to sell it, Emily has to approve." Julia's mouth tightened. She'd never agree. Probably not. Then I added something that made the room even quieter. "And there's another rule." Julia looked impatient. "What now?" "If either of you tries to force me out of this house, Emily will move in." Julia's face went pale. "Move in?" "Yes. She owns half the house, and legally she has every right to live here." Mark exhaled slowly. "You planned all of this." "No," I said. "I simply protected myself." Julia turned away and ran her hand through her hair. "This is unbelievable." But Mark looked at me with something different. Not anger, not resentment. Something closer to understanding. He finally said something I didn't expect. "Dad, I'm sorry." Julia spun around. "Mark!" But he kept talking. "I should have stopped things before they got this far." I nodded. "I know." Julia looked between us in disbelief. "You're apologizing to him?" Mark answered quietly. "Yes." For the first time since they came back from the beach, the tension in the room started to fade. Julia sat down at the table. Slowly. Then she asked a question she hadn't asked before. "What do you want?" I looked at her. "Respect." She frowned. "That's it?" "Yes." I walked toward the porch door. Rocky followed me. As I stepped outside, the evening air felt cool and calm. Behind me, I could hear Mark and Julia talking quietly. For the first time in years, they were talking about the house like it wasn't just theirs. Sometimes people only remember what something means when they realize they might lose it. And that beach trip they took, it turned out to be the most expensive vacation they'd ever had. because when they left me alone with the dog, they had no idea I was about to change the rules of the house forever. Ending. In the weeks that followed, the house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, but because the attitude inside them had. Julia stopped calling it our place. Mark started asking before making decisions. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I actually lived there again. Sometimes respect doesn't come from arguments. Sometimes it comes from a single quiet decision that reminds everyone who built the home in the first place.